So Jane Davidson is with us this morning for our keynote of the day. And while she needs no introduction, I'm just going to give her a brief one. Jane has long been engaged with education, sustainability, and the environment. She's one of the founding members of the Welsh Assembly and spent 11 years as the Minister of Education, then moving on to the Environment Minister. She is the person who proposed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and she is also one of the architects of this radically forward-looking piece of legislation that puts sustainability at the heart of government. She's currently Pro-Vice Chancellor Emeritus at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and her book, Future Gen, Lessons from a Small Country, which examines the creation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, was published, I think, this past August. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jane.
Alicia, thank you very much for that introduction, and can I very warmly welcome all those of you who are able to join with us this morning. Back earlier this year, I was invited to become chair of the Wales inquiry for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. I'm sure that most people on this call know that the Commission, which started off with the RSA and produced a seminal document, which became the most downloaded document the RSA had ever produced, proposed radical changes to the food systems, the land use systems, the trade systems, etc. in the UK. And on the back of that, an application was made to the Esme Fairbairn Trust for funding to take the Commission's work to a next step, a proper delivery plan. That application was also successful, and as a result, a totally independent Food, Farming and Countryside Commission was formed earlier this year. And I was very pleased to be invited to chair the Wales Inquiry for that commission. And that role of chair of the Wales Inquiry, which I do entirely voluntarily, because like every small organisation, we have no funding, it's all very little. But actually the Wales Inquiry, just as there are inquiries in Scotland, in Northern Ireland and in regions across England, is actually looking at how we can dramatically transform our food systems, our trade systems, our land systems in terms of responding to the climate challenges, responding to poverty and health and diet challenges, responding to new economic opportunities. So what I'm going to do in this short session this morning is just look at how in Wales we're framing our response to this in the context of the Future Generations Act, which is why I was asked to take on the role of the chair of the Wales Inquiry. My credentials are in the hobby territory, I have to say. Although we have been pretty well self-sufficient in our own family for many years in the context of what we produce. We grow our own fruit and veg. We keep pigs, turkeys, ducks and chickens. We forage. And I noticed that on the slide I've shown you that there are 2 alcoholic inputs there, but we make a lot of cider as well, and apple juice. And we provide our press facilities, etc., to friends and others who want to use them at any point. So I'm acutely aware that I am not a farmer. And what I've loved about the conference this year and previous years is that I hear from people who are making a living out of self-sufficiency and beyond. And it's not about, for me, it's not about just the aspect of what you produce. It's actually about the lifestyle choices. It's about doing everything you can to contribute towards sustainability. So it's about the kind of life you lead. What buildings do you live in, where you get your heating from, and what we've tried to do as a family is to take all those choices. We run our home off solar and ground source heat pump, for example. We drive electrically, we drive as little as possible. My new electric bike is one of the best things I've ever had, particularly living in a rural area with lots of hills. And I know that many people on this call will have made similar choices. And partly it's about how we can encourage more people to make more choices in this vein, in the context of tackling the big issues in front of us. I'm just going to show 2 slides for those who are not aware of the kind of core content of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. This is the set of 7 goals. And if you just have a quick read of that top goal, I have yet to find another country in the world that has actually, in law, put in place the notion of an innovative, productive and low carbon society which recognises the limits of the global environment. And if we also talks about a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. Now, if you just think about that and we start thinking about how we might apply that to agriculture and land use, and in fact to every aspect of our society in Wales. And if we also then think about how we enhance the biodiverse natural environment, although I do wish the Resilient Wales goal was called a nature goal, because I think it would be much more understandable to people if it was. If we maximise people's physical and mental well-being, if we drive towards greater equality, if we try and sponsor and create and support cohesive communities, if we celebrate culture, language, sports, the arts, and if in everything we do not offshore, for example, our carbon emissions, that is exactly the kind of country I want to live in. And it's exactly the kind of country which can really demonstrate very, very different kinds of ways of working in the context of agriculture, farming, and indeed all aspects of economy and business. What is interesting about this particular set of goals is they fit in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And bizarrely, when I was writing the book, I found that Wales is the only country in the world that actually has a legal mechanism to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, this is extraordinarily awful. I hope everybody on this call thinks this is extraordinarily awful, but it's also extraordinarily ambitious for a small country to do that. And I think there's a big challenge to us all in terms of helping the government and public services, both by holding them to account, but also by demonstrating the appetite for living a life according to the SDGs. The second element, which is really important in the context of the discussions around food and farming, are about what's called the ways of working. Also in the legislation, there are 5 ways of working. It is about thinking long term. It is about prevention. It is about integrating those goals. So it's not just thinking about the nature goal, but thinking about the nature goal, the prosperity goal, the healthier Wales goal, the cohesive communities goal, etc., all together. What can we do that maximises the outcomes across a wide range of areas, not just silos? How do we collaborate to make that happen most effectively? And really importantly, how do we involve the people with an interest in achieving those goals? And of course, this kind of event is exactly the ways in which we can offer opportunities to people to engage in these big debates and influence people locally and in the context of their work and in the context of their activism. And this just very quickly shows, for example, how if we take that Resilient Wales goal, we see which of the SDGs that it maps against. So that's the background. So if we just go back to those goals for a moment, think about, in the context of these, where food and farming can make a contribution to Wales's prosperity, to enhancing Wales's biodiversity, to creating a healthier society, to creating more equality, to creating cohesive communities, to supporting and enhancing Wales's vibrant culture and language and Wales's global responsibility. Recently, and I just saw Shay join the call a moment ago, the WWF in Wales commissioned a report called A Welsh Food System Fit for Future Generations. And what it has done is actually focused on using the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to create a food system that actually supports food for all, an agenda around making sure that no one is left behind in terms of decisions that are made about food, that looks at new opportunities in terms of the economy, and a food system that actually is kind to the environment, which is not what we have at the moment. And if you haven't looked at it, I recommend that you go to the WWF site and pick it up. But I think what's really important about the fact that independent research, university research from Cardiff University that underpinned that report, demonstrates that actually if you really think about opportunities, there is a strong academic and other base in terms of delivery. What we want to do as a commission, and this is across the whole of the UK, is we want to find those radical but practical ways to improve our climate, nature, health and economy. Healthy food has to be everybody's business. I remember many, many years ago working with Professor Tim Lang when I led an anti-poverty organisation, actually looking at what was called the European basket, which was actually about how any benefit systems should ensure that there was enough food, enough money for food to enable you to feed a family of 4. And that should be the fundamental underpinning principle. Now, I don't know whether that's left anywhere in Europe, but it's been left behind in the UK for about 10 years at absolute minimum. We need to think about how farming can be a force for change. If we look at the UK Climate Change Commission's report, we know that actually Wales has probably a bigger set of challenges than other parts of the UK in terms of changing the way that we farm. And the idea of a transition plan for agroecology by 2030 gives us enormous opportunities across the whole of the UK to actually define what that looks like at the country level. And there is this very important big kind of kutch, which is how the countryside should work for everyone. And I think what's quite interesting just in the last week or so with this announcement about the National Forest, in the sense of building on our current woodlands and forests and joining them all up in an integrated way, but also building new opportunities, is potentially very exciting if people are prepared to release land into that. How quickly can we join up North and South Wales, East and West Wales, through a national forest that grows organically as part of a universal way forward in our country? And I think that, just in case that people don't know what agroecology is, and I had to ask that question, it kind of sounded great. I like ecology. I think, therefore, if we're going to look at food and farming in an ecological way, agroecology sounds a great phrase. But actually, it's more than that. It's a discipline. And therefore, this definition is really important. And you can immediately see that in the context of this definition, you can see how you could immediately map over the UN, the Agriculture Organization, the UN's definition in the context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it does therefore give us specific opportunities in Wales in terms of creating a sustainable and fair food system. So the Food Farming and Countryside Commission's planned programme of work across the UK is about convening leadership and conversations. It's not for us in our learning agenda, and it's very important to me in chairing the Wales inquiry that this is an inquiry. We're not coming to this with a notion of how to do. We've got a set of principles that have been agreed in the next stages of the inquiry, including those principles in tackling those issues around climate, health, etc. But our job is to convene leadership and conversations to try and help that just transition, whether that's climate or Brexit. And the first report came up with a series of recommendations around a land use framework, a transition plan for sustainable agroecological farming, the idea of an agroecology development bank and a national nature service. And the National Nature Service one is a good example about the fact that what is likely to be implemented in England, which is a very targeted programme in terms of unemployed people, bringing them out of cities into rural areas, is in the process of being created in Wales in a much more universal way. I mean, I think the main principle, as people have been arguing, those who've been involved in those discussions so far, and there's an open invitation in terms of people getting involved in these discussions, is if you think about a National Health Service applied to nature, and if you think at the beginning of the National Health Service, when it's with lots of little pockets of things that all join up to a much bigger picture and become loved by the nation, that's the sort of way in which we hope we can take forward a vision for the National Nature Service in Wales. It may not be called a National Nature Service, but hopefully it will have that universal application, but it will be doing good on the ground. It will physically be enabling the regeneration of some of our degraded sites. It'll be engaged between people who have those opportunities to offer and those who have people to offer to opportunities. It'll be building that bigger picture about what does an agroecological Wales look like. And therefore, there's a big issue for us about how we resource this and how we learn from the country and county inquiries. So in terms of Wales, we've got very specific goals in the context of how we take this forward. Fair and healthy food systems is absolutely critical. I mean, there'll be other people on this call who are supporting financially their local food banks. There are far too many food banks in operation because of the nature of the benefit system, but also the impact of COVID. And we do need to be thinking about how to make sure that we have, in terms of an integrated system, that we have something that is actually fair and healthy and enables people on all incomes to have access to food. I mean, in Scotland, they're talking about a right to food. But if you think of Maslow's hierarchy at the need, and there at the bottom of the pyramid, the things that we absolutely need as humans to survive is about food and energy and safety and a home. And we must be ensured in terms of actually taking that forward. We want to see how far we can take this agroecology agenda in Wales, but that's a conversation. It's not about mandating. It may well be that governments of the future will mandate because this is the right way forward, but we have to help them in terms of creating the right systems. We need to look at whether public spending is aligned with policy intentions. We've, interestingly enough, just had an announcement this morning that, from the UK government about a 10-point plan on climate change with £4 billion of extra funding, when HS2 has £100 billion of extra funding. So in a sense, we need to think about ensuring that the public spending, which is not aligned with Welsh policy intentions, needs to very explicitly be removed over a number of years. And we have to justify what the resources are for a just transition. So these are the particular goals we've set ourselves over the 3-year working plan in Wales. And underpinning those goals are 4 key questions. So what structures do we need in government to make those decisions effective? Do we need a ministry for food? Do we need a minister specifically responsible for food and joining up all these issues? I mean, we've seen food sit in agriculture portfolios, in economy portfolios, and actually where it sits matters. So what do we need in terms of actually making this a much wider agenda? How do we strengthen the place of healthy and sustainable food systems in local decision-making and planning? And what are the benefits of putting agroecology centre stage in Welsh plans for the well-being of future generations? I mean, only this week, in fact, yesterday and the day before, there was a big conference on social value, a new social value portal announced, where the Future Generations Commissioner has worked with the government in terms of looking at what are the themes, outcomes and measures to actually demonstrate that we get social value to environmental projects, and where the environmental projects, where social projects can also demonstrate environmental value. What are the themes, outcomes and measures? Now there is a tool there that people can use that is directly linked to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And what duties would Welsh Government need to put on public bodies? I mean, this is something I've been arguing in my book in the context of, where does government need to go next? The Act puts duties upon government and public bodies to take account of that Act and deliver sustainable outcomes. But what mechanisms are there in place through the Commissioner, through the Audit Office, through government and others in the context of how that is delivered, so that there's a constant squeeze all the time taking us to a more sustainable agenda? And I just finished with this slide about the Wales Inquiry. We'll make these slides available alongside this talk. I put the links on the slides, but if you want to read a little more detail about where we're going on this in Wales, we launched this in the week of what would have been the Royal Welsh Show in July. And this is a really open agenda. We need help to make this happen in Wales. And we know that the people who are on this call are exactly the people who have a stake, already have a stake in terms of wanting to make and create a more sustainable Wales fit for future generations. So if I stop there, Alicia, hopefully we'll have some time for questions.
That sounds good. Now, if you want to put questions forth, you can either enter those in the chat now, or you can also just, I don't know if we can do a system where we raise our hands, people who want to ask questions. Are there anyone? I don't see anyone. I might start with a question then. I know that you were Minister of Education for quite a long time, and my question has to do with how I knew a new curriculum is coming in very shortly into Wales, and how you see that working to really engage children, because I do think on two levels, both in terms of what they eat and how they engage with eating a healthier diet than the one that a lot do. There's, as we all know, a huge problem with obesity, and also how we can connect that back to growing food, which I think is really key, again, in getting kids to eat well.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I mean, I think this is very interesting because back in 2003, when I was Education Minister, I piloted what was called, what is still called, the foundation phase, which is the period of life in a school child's experience from the age of 3 to 7. And I deliberately did it in a way that was from preschooling through into statutory schooling, so that it was actually a programme, but particularly in a sense to help people from the most deprived communities to actually engage their children in a programme preschool, to try and help in terms of what is often an enormous gap between children from different environments when they come on their first day into statutory schooling. When I started that pilot, I used to visit. I mean, I think I visited as Education Minister 3/4 of all the schools in Wales. And when I started that pilot, I was visiting schools in Wales, and everybody, the head teachers all wanted to tarmac over any grass because they were feeling budget squeezes, and they wanted they found that paying for grass to be cut or whatever was just a problem. But once we started the pilot and it started taking hold, and now that is a proper part of the Welsh education system, we found that completely the opposite happened. Instead of wanting to tarmac over their schoolyards, they wanted to dig them up. Because lots and lots of schools, particularly all those in the pilot, because obviously they were really champing at the bit to act more sustainably, started introducing school gardens and creating places on the school site for children to experience nature. And that has now been built in to the foundation phase. And it is one of the areas of learning. And what is exciting about the new curriculum is that area of learning will now go all the way through to the age of 18. And so I'm confident that the areas of learning provide the opportunities, because they also look at issues around kind of art and culture, etc., as well as the more mainstream subjects. So and they're seen in terms of literacy and numeracy rather than English and maths, for example. So I am confident the areas of learning enable a very different kind of curriculum, which is being put in place at the moment. And the idea is that it will go into schools in 2022. And these things take about 15 years in terms of tracking through a school system. But there'll still be lots of opportunities within that for teachers to be able to express their own views and to add many layers in the context. And when I'm actually engaged with the young people through Teach the Future at the moment, in Wales and more widely, who are young people who have very clear ideas about what they want the curriculum across Wales and elsewhere to teach. And I think there must be a much bigger engagement with young people. They're far better as a generation in terms of understanding that there are major issues around climate change facing them. And they do have very clear ideas about the skills that they want to be taught in college, in university, and in schools. So the SOS global movement coming through universities and colleges, and the Teach the Future movement coming through in the terms of schools, I think that we really need to find a formal way of that they're becoming a commentary in terms of the how the curriculum is developed.
Fantastic. Yeah. We have one other question just before we go, which I'm sorry, my cat, I have a very difficult cat, which is around public spending. What influence can Wales have with UK government to ensure their spending decisions in Wales are in accordance with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act?
Well, this is a really interesting and important point. We could be in a position relatively shortly, and one of our strands of work through the Food Farming and Countryside Commission is called Trade Unwrapped. We could be in a position very shortly, if the Internal Market Bill becomes legislation, not only will it break international treaties, as I'm sure people will be aware from the public dialogue, but you will also probably be aware that the governments of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are acutely conscious that it will ride roughshod over devolution. The UK government is not bound by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, other than in areas that are in the responsibility of the Welsh Government. So this will involve some legal unpacking. And it's very important unpacking because, of course, the Welsh Government decided not to support the M4 relief road on the grounds that it would be ecologically disastrous. The UK government is very clearly saying that they will provide money to Wales in terms of delivery of that. Now, it may be, and I think that there is a level of confidence about that particular one, that actually all the aspects of the delivery will be subject to Welsh law in terms of planning and everything else. So I'm less worried about that one than the principle that actually in areas that are the responsibility of the UK government, that they will be able to do things that do not take account in any way of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I think there is potentially a difficult relationship, and that is why all the devolved administrations, and of course very different political inputs in the devolved administrations, are calling for new constitutional arrangements in the context of the dialogue between the four governments of the UK, in terms of ensuring that what people vote for in Wales, for example, in terms of their representation, is then seen through into the policies that are delivered. So very important question here. The only slightly more hopeful approach is that, if you're not aware, John Bird, he of Big Issue fame, has put a proposal for a UK Future Generations Bill in front of the UK Parliament, and he's working with Caroline Lucas to try and get the government to endorse that. And that is having its second reading at the end of January. And of course, if we did have a UK Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, that encompass similar commitments that link to the climate change legislation, then of course we would both be able to look each other in the eye and be very content that we could use that as a framing for the future.
That's so great. Thank you,
support
Jane.
That, the Today for Tomorrow campaign.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to close that down. We're already a minute over, but thank you so much for your inspiring talk this morning. It's been really fantastic. And also thank you to everyone who's joined us today.